The first time I told my neighbor his new swimming pool was crossing onto my property, he laughed loud enough for every construction worker to hear. Then he pointed at my backyard and said, "Nobody can stop this project. By next week, you'll be looking at my pool every morning." The crew laughed with him while another excavator dug even deeper into what I knew was my land. I called the county. They ignored me. I hired a surveyor. My neighbor mocked that too. "You'll waste your money," he said. "I've got permits. I've got lawyers. I've got connections." For 3 weeks, the concrete kept spreading farther into my yard, and every day his confidence grew bigger. Then one quiet evening, a survey crew hammered a single wooden stake into the ground beside the excavation. Nothing else happened. No arguments. No police. No shouting. Just one small survey stake standing in the dirt. My neighbor laughed when he saw it. By sunrise the next morning, every bulldozer, cement truck, and excavator had vanished. Construction fences were being torn down, workers refused to answer questions, and a man who had spent weeks calling me powerless suddenly wouldn't even look me in the eye. My name is Michael Carter, and I'm 39 years old. For the past 15 years, I've worked as a financial analyst in Chicago, where my days revolve around numbers, contracts, and finding mistakes most people overlook. I like predictable routines, quiet mornings, and problems that can be solved with patience instead of arguments. That's probably why my grandparents always said their little house would suit me one day. When they both passed away within 18 months of each other, they left me the home they had owned for nearly 50 years. It sat on a peaceful corner lot in a quiet Illinois suburb where people still waved while mowing their lawns and children rode bicycles until sunset. It wasn't fancy, but every tree, flower bed, and wooden fence carried a memory. Selling it never crossed my mind. The first 6 months were exactly what I'd hoped for. My evenings were spent restoring the backyard garden my grandfather loved, while weekends meant grilling on the patio or reading beneath the old maple tree that shaded half the yard. And the house next door sold. The moving trucks arrived first, followed by luxury SUVs, landscapers, contractors, and eventually a man named Brian Dawson. He looked to be in his mid-40s, dressed like he had stepped out of a real estate magazine. Within minutes of introducing himself, he managed to mention the value of his company twice and casually informed me that he planned to transform the property into the nicest home in the neighborhood. At first, I figured he was simply excited. Over the next 2 weeks, demolition crews stripped almost everything from his backyard. Trees disappeared. Patios vanished. Dump trucks came and went from sunrise until evening. Whenever I walked outside, Brian was giving instructions with the confidence of someone who believed every decision he made was automatically the correct one. One afternoon, while watering my tomatoes, I noticed several bright orange survey flags sticking unusually close to my side of the yard. I frowned. I'm pretty sure those weren't there yesterday. The following morning, 2 of the flags had somehow moved even closer. I walked outside, carrying the property survey my grandfather had kept in a weatherproof folder for decades. Comparing the measurements, something immediately felt wrong. The excavation markings appeared several feet inside what I had always known to be my backyard. Before I could think much more about it, an excavator rumbled through Brian's gate. Its steel bucket lowered into the ground. The first scoop of dirt landed exactly where my grandfather had planted roses 20 years earlier. Standing there with the old survey still in my hands, I felt something I couldn't quite explain. Not anger, not fear, just the unmistakable feeling that someone had crossed a line they believed I'd never defend. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Property surveys could be confusing. Contractors sometimes misplaced markers. Maybe the crew had simply measured from the wrong corner. Whatever had happened, I believed a calm conversation would solve it before any real damage was done. The next morning, I waited until Brian finished speaking with his foreman before walking across the grass. "Morning," I said. He turned with an easy smile. "Michael, enjoying the construction? I actually wanted to ask about the excavation. It looks like it's crossing onto my property." His smile didn't disappear. Instead, it became amused. "You've got nothing to worry about. I checked my survey last night. So did my contractor. I held up the folded property map my grandfather had carefully preserved for years. I think we should compare these before anyone digs any farther. Brian glanced at the paper, but never reached for it. My permits are approved, he said confidently. The county already signed off. I understand. I'm only asking because the measurements don't seem right. He laughed loud enough for several workers to hear. You know how many neighbors panic during renovations? Happens all the time. A few members of the construction crew looked over. One of them quickly looked away again. I'd just like someone to verify the property line, I replied. Brian folded his arms. Michael, you're worrying over a couple of feet of dirt. A couple of feet can still belong to someone. He shook his head. You accountants always think everything fits neatly inside little boxes. Before I could answer, he turned toward the foreman. Keep digging. The excavator roared back to life. Its bucket cut another section from the edge of my backyard while I stood there watching. I noticed one younger worker hesitate before climbing into a skid steer. As he drove past me, he lowered his voice. We just build what we're told, sir. Then he kept going. By late afternoon, the excavation stretched even farther across the line I believed belonged to my property. Brian walked over carrying a bottle of sparkling water. You'll thank me when it's finished, he said. A luxury pool next door increases everyone's property value. I don't care about property values. What do you care about? My property. He smiled again, but this time there wasn't any friendliness behind it. Nobody's stopping this project. I looked past him at the growing hole, the broken flower beds, and the fresh piles of dirt where my grandfather's rose bushes had stood for decades. Arguing wasn't accomplishing anything. Neither was raising my voice. So instead of saying another word, I pulled out my phone. I photographed every survey flag, every machine, every fresh trench, every measurement I could see. Brian noticed and chuckled. Take all the pictures you want, he called after me. You'll have a nice scrapbook when my pool is finished. I spent most of that evening organizing the photographs I'd taken. Every image went into its own folder with the exact time and date. I labeled each one carefully, comparing the changing excavation line from morning to afternoon. Years of working in finance had taught me one important lesson. Opinions rarely settle disputes. Records did. The next morning, I called the county building department. After 23 minutes on hold, a woman finally answered. I'd like to report what I believe is construction crossing onto my property, I explained. Do you have a permit number? No, it's my neighbor's project. I'll need the address. I gave it to her. She typed for a moment. The permits appear valid. I understand, but I think the property line may be wrong. If you believe there's a boundary dispute, you'll need to contact the zoning office or hire a licensed surveyor. So no one can inspect it. We can schedule an inspection, but current wait times are approximately 2 weeks. 2 weeks. By then, the pool could already be finished. I thanked her anyway and called the zoning office. They directed me to the county survey records department. The survey records department referred me back to the building department. By lunchtime, I'd spent nearly 4 hours making phone calls without getting a single clear answer. Meanwhile, construction never slowed down. Every time I looked out my kitchen window, another truck arrived. Concrete forms were stacked beside the excavation. Steel reinforcement bars lay across what I believed was still my backyard. That afternoon, Brian spotted me standing near the fence. Still making phone calls? He shouted. I am. Good luck. He laughed before turning back toward the workers. They'll tell you exactly what I told you. One of my longtime neighbors, Mrs. Reynolds, walked over while Brian wasn't looking. She lowered her voice. I hate seeing this happen. You noticed it too? She nodded. I think they're awfully close to your yard. Would you be willing to say that if someone asked later? She hesitated. I'd rather stay out of it. I couldn't blame her. Most people avoid conflicts with neighbors whenever possible. By Friday afternoon, fresh concrete footings had been marked, and the excavation stretched even farther across the area where my grandparents had planted flowers for decades. That evening, 2 of my friends came over after hearing what was happening. Both studied the photographs. One finally sighed. If he's got permits and expensive lawyers, maybe you're better off letting a few feet go. I looked through the window toward the construction site. It wasn't just a few feet anymore. It was my property, and if I walked away now, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering why I never bothered to prove where the truth actually began. Instead of giving up, I opened my laptop and searched for the most experienced licensed land surveyor in the county. The surveyor returned my call the following morning. His name was David Lawson, and he had been surveying property boundaries for more than 30 years. I looked at your address before calling back, he said. That subdivision has some older lots. If something feels wrong, it's worth checking. When can you come? Monday morning. At exactly 8 o'clock Monday, a white pickup truck pulled into my driveway. Two assistants climbed out carrying tripods, GPS receivers, measuring rods, and bright orange equipment cases. David introduced himself with a firm handshake before quietly studying the properties on both sides. We don't assume anything, he said. We measure everything. For the next several hours, the crew worked with remarkable precision. They searched for original iron boundary pins buried beneath the grass. They compared old subdivision maps with current county records. Laser equipment blinked in the morning sunlight while measurements were checked, recorded, and checked again. Across the fence, Brian watched the entire process with obvious amusement. Around noon, he walked over holding a cup of coffee. So, he called loudly enough for everyone to hear. How much is this little treasure hunt costing you? I smiled politely, enough to know the truth. He laughed. I already know the truth. My contractor handled all this months ago. David didn't even look up from his instrument. He simply continued recording numbers. Brian waited another moment before shaking his head. You're wasting your money, Michael. Without answering, I stepped back and let the professionals work. By late afternoon, David asked me to walk with him toward the excavation. He unfolded several printed maps beside the equipment truck and pointed to a series of matching measurements. These are your recorded property corners. I nodded. These are the construction stakes your neighbor is using. My eyes followed the lines across the page. They didn't match. Based on every measurement we've confirmed today, David said calmly, the excavation has crossed approximately 9 feet onto your legal property. For a second, I simply stared at the map. 9 feet. Far more than I'd feared. David continued. The concrete shell they're preparing cannot legally remain where it's being built. What happens now? That's your decision. He reached into the truck, removed a wooden survey stake with bright orange ribbon attached, and walked to the edge of the excavation. Using a small hammer, he drove the stake firmly into the ground. The sound echoed through the quiet afternoon. Tap, tap, tap. Every construction worker stopped to watch. Brian looked over from his patio and burst into laughter. One little stick, he shouted. That's what all this was for. David packed away his equipment without responding. Before climbing into his truck, he handed me a sealed folder. Everything you need is in there, he said. Now the facts can speak for themselves. The survey crew drove away just before 5 o'clock. The neighborhood became quiet again, except for the occasional beep of construction equipment backing into position. The only new thing left behind was the wooden survey stake standing beside the excavation, its bright orange ribbon moving gently in the afternoon breeze. I remained in my yard, holding the sealed survey folder. Brian climbed down from his patio and walked straight toward the stake. He looked at it for a few seconds before shaking his head. This, he said with a grin. He nudged the ground beside it with the toe of his expensive work boots. This little piece of wood is supposed to stop a $1 million renovation. Several workers laughed. One even pulled out his phone, apparently amused by the scene. Brian folded his arms and looked directly at me. You really think this changes anything? I think facts matter. My permits matter more. He turned toward his foreman. Don't let a survey stake slow us down. The foreman hesitated only briefly before nodding. Keep pouring tomorrow morning. The crew returned to preparing the forms exactly as if nothing had happened. I didn't argue. I didn't remind Brian what the surveyor had said. I simply walked back into my house. For the next 2 hours, my dining room table became an office. I carefully opened the survey folder. Inside were certified maps, measurement reports, photographs, legal descriptions, and David Lawson's signed professional opinion confirming that the excavation crossed approximately 9 feet onto my property. I made several copies. One complete package went into a large certified mail envelope addressed to the county building department. Another went to the zoning office. A third was delivered electronically to the real estate attorney I'd contacted earlier that afternoon. The final certified copy was addressed to Brian Dawson himself. Not a threatening letter, not an emotional message, just a complete survey with a short note. Please review the enclosed certified boundary survey before continuing construction. That was all. After sealing the envelopes, I drove to the post office before it closed. As I pulled away, I passed Brian's property. He was standing beside the excavation laughing with several contractors while pointing toward the survey stake. He looked completely relaxed, completely confident. He mistook my silence for surrender. What he didn't realize was that I had stopped trying to convince him. From that moment forward, the documents would do all the talking for me. The certified mail receipts arrived 2 days later. Every envelope had been delivered. The county had the survey. The zoning office had the survey. My attorney had the survey. And, most importantly, Brian had signed for his copy personally. Construction, however, continued as though none of it existed. By Thursday afternoon, workers were preparing to pour the concrete shell. They moved with the confidence of a crew that believed every approval had already been secured. My attorney, Jennifer Collins, called just after lunch. "I've spent the morning reviewing both surveys," she said. "Mine and Brian's?" "Exactly." There was a pause before she continued. "I think I know why everyone believes they're right." That caught my attention. "What did you find?" "The permit drawings your neighbors submitted weren't based on the current property boundaries." "They weren't?" "No." She explained that years before I inherited the house, the county had approved a minor lot line adjustment involving several properties in the subdivision. It wasn't dramatic, just a legal correction made after newer GPS measurements replaced older boundary records. Most homeowners never even noticed. But the updated records became the official property lines, Jennifer said. "So how did this happen?" Brian's contractor appears to have relied on an older survey that predates the adjustment. I sat quietly, letting the information sink in. "So the permits weren't fake?" "No," she replied. "The permits themselves are legitimate, but they're attached to incorrect measurements." Exactly. For the first time since this started, everything made sense. Brian hadn't intentionally applied for permission to build on my land. He had simply trusted outdated information without verifying it against the current county records. Unfortunately for him, the law didn't measure intent. It measured property boundaries. Jennifer continued, "A permit only authorizes work within the legal parcel described in the application. And once construction crosses that parcel, the permit no longer protects the work outside it." I looked through my window toward the excavation. Workers were positioning steel reinforcement while concrete trucks waited near the street. "They're getting ready to pour tomorrow." "I know. So what happens now?" "I've already prepared an emergency request for injunctive relief." The legal phrase sounded clinical, almost ordinary, but Jennifer explained it simply. If the judge signs it, construction must stop until the boundary dispute is resolved. Before ending the call, she asked me to email every photograph I'd taken since the first day excavation began. Within an hour, my inbox held confirmation that the court filing had been submitted along with David Lawson's certified survey, my photographs, county records, and a detailed timeline of every conversation I documented. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't hoping someone would listen. The evidence was finally speaking louder than either of us ever could. Friday arrived with an uneasy sense of normality. By 8 o'clock, the construction site sounded exactly as it had every morning for the past 3 weeks. Engine started. Workers unloaded equipment. Concrete forms were adjusted while the foreman reviewed the day's schedule. If anyone had received the court filing or reviewed the certified survey, they certainly weren't showing it. I stood on my back patio with a mug of coffee, watching without saying a word. Brian noticed me almost immediately. He lifted his cup in a mock toast. "Beautiful morning," he called across the fence. "It is. Looks like the project's still moving." I simply nodded. There was nothing left to argue about. Around noon, 2 white county vehicles slowly entered the neighborhood. Neither had flashing lights. Neither attracted much attention. The inspectors parked near the street, stepped out carrying clipboards, and quietly walked toward the excavation. Brian greeted them with a confident smile I'd seen dozens of times before. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. No raised voices, no pointing, no dramatic reactions. One inspector compared several documents with the survey stake still standing beside the excavation. The other took measurements with a handheld GPS unit before writing several notes on his clipboard. The workers kept moving around them, assuming it was another routine inspection. Even Brian appeared completely relaxed. When the inspectors finished, they shook hands with him, returned to their vehicles, and drove away without saying another word. Brian looked over at me and spread his hands as if to say, "See, I told you nothing would happen." For a moment, I almost wondered if he was right. Then my attorney called. "The inspection is finished," Jennifer said. "Did you hear something?" "I did. And they've confirmed the certified boundary survey." My grip tightened around the phone. "What happens next?" "You wait. That's it. That's it. No confrontation. No warning. The county already has everything it needs." I looked back toward the construction site. Workers were cleaning up for the evening while Brian laughed with his foreman beside the unfinished pool. Nothing looked different. Nothing sounded different. But somehow the entire atmosphere had changed. The decision had already been made. The only people who didn't know it yet were the ones still making plans for tomorrow morning. I woke up before sunrise the next morning. For the past several weeks, construction had become my unwanted alarm clock. Every day began the same way. Diesel engines, backup alarms, workers shouting to one another before the first shovel ever touched the ground. That morning, I heard nothing. At first, I thought I'd simply woken up too early. I made coffee, walked onto my back patio, and waited. The neighborhood remained unusually quiet. No trucks, no generators, no excavators. Only birds moving through the maple tree my grandfather had planted decades earlier. I looked toward Brian's backyard. The construction gate stood open. Beyond it, the excavation sat completely empty. My coffee cup froze halfway to my mouth. I slipped on my shoes and walked to the front yard. Several neighbors were already outside wearing the same confused expressions. Mrs. Reynolds pointed toward Brian's driveway. "They're gone." She was right. Every cement mixer had disappeared. The bulldozers were gone. The skid steers had vanished. Even the portable office trailer had been removed overnight. It looked as though the entire construction company had packed up and left while everyone slept. As we stood there, 2 county vehicles slowly pulled onto the street. This time, there was no quiet inspection. The inspectors stepped out carrying bright orange notices and walked directly to the temporary construction fence. One by one, they fastened official documents to the entrance gate, the equipment barrier, and the permit board facing the street. Even from my yard, the bold letters were impossible to miss. "Stop work order." Brian came rushing out his front door, still wearing jeans and a wrinkled polo shirt. "What is this?" he demanded. One inspector calmly handed him another copy of the notice. Their conversation stayed professional. No shouting, no accusations. Brian pointed repeatedly toward the backyard, then toward my house, speaking faster with every sentence. The inspector listened patiently before answering with only a few quiet words. Whatever he said completely changed Brian's expression. His shoulders dropped. The confidence that had followed him for weeks simply disappeared. He looked toward the unfinished pool, then at the wooden survey stake still standing beside it. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he didn't laugh. Within an hour, more vehicles arrived. Not construction crews, removal crews. Workers carefully collected temporary fencing, stacked and used materials, and loaded equipment onto trailers. No one mixed concrete. No one started machinery. Nobody even walked into the excavation. As one trailer pulled away, Brian noticed me standing quietly near my fence. Our eyes met across the empty work site. For weeks, he greeted me with confident smiles and sarcastic comments. This time, he looked away first. Without saying a single word, I finally understood what that small wooden survey stake had really accomplished. By Monday morning, the entire neighborhood had transformed into an audience. People who normally rushed to work slowed their cars as they passed Brian's house. Dog walkers lingered a little longer near the sidewalk. Curtains shifted as curious neighbors watched from their front windows. The unfinished pool had become the center of every conversation. Around 10 o'clock, another county vehicle arrived. This time, a senior building official stepped out carrying a thick folder. Brian was already waiting at the construction gate. Even from my yard, I could tell he hadn't slept much. His usually polished appearance had disappeared. His shirt was wrinkled, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes. The official greeted him politely before opening the folder. Brian erupted almost immediately. He pointed toward his permit board, then toward the excavation, speaking with the same confidence I'd heard for weeks. The official listened without interrupting. When Brian finally stopped talking, the official removed several documents from the folder and calmly laid them across the hood of his vehicle. Even from a distance, I recognized one of them. It was David Lawson's certified survey. The official traced a finger along the property lines before comparing them with Brian's approved construction drawings. Then he pointed directly toward the wooden survey stake. Brian looked down. For several long seconds, he didn't say anything. Finally, he shook his head. The official spoke again, his tone remaining calm and professional. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. The permit is valid only within the legal parcel. Certified boundary, encroachment, construction outside the approved limits. Each sentence seemed to drain more confidence from Brian's face. A few minutes later, Jennifer called. The county finished its review. I can see them. They've officially confirmed the encroachment. So that's final? It is. She explained that Brian's permits had never authorized construction beyond his legal property line. Once the concrete foundation crossed onto my land, every additional step violated the conditions under which those permits had been issued. The county can't simply ignore that, she said. What happens to the pool? It has to be removed from your property before any construction can continue. I looked toward the excavation. Weeks of digging, thousands of dollars in materials, countless hours of work. None of it mattered anymore. Not because someone wanted revenge, because the law couldn't recognize a structure built across a certified property boundary. Brian slowly folded the paperwork and slipped it into his folder. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, he looked like a man who had finally realized that confidence wasn't evidence. Permits weren't magic. Money couldn't redraw legal property lines. And one quiet surveyor with accurate measurements had accomplished what weeks of arguments never could. Tuesday morning looked completely different from every day that had come before. Instead of cement trucks lining the street, flatbed trailers and demolition equipment rolled quietly into the neighborhood. Workers wearing bright safety vests climbed out, but these weren't the same crews who had been building Brian's dream backyard. These crews had come to take it apart. I watched from my porch as the site supervisor gathered everyone together for a short briefing. He pointed toward the official county notices still attached to the construction fence before directing the crew toward the unfinished pool. Within minutes, concrete saws started humming. The sharp sound echoed across the neighborhood. A section of the newly poured pool wall was carefully cut into manageable pieces before a small excavator lifted the broken slabs into waiting dumpsters. Every load that disappeared represented another expensive mistake. Brian stood nearby with his hands in his pockets. For the first time since he'd moved next door, he wasn't giving instructions. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't telling everyone how easily things would work out. He simply watched. Several neighbors quietly gathered along the sidewalk. No one celebrated. No one mocked him. Most people just stood silently, realizing how quickly confidence could disappear when reality finally caught up. Around noon, Jennifer called again. The county approved the corrective plan, she said. What does that involve? Everything built across your property has to be removed. And after that, if Brian wants a pool, he'll need revised engineering plans, updated permits, and a completely new layout that stays inside his legal boundary. So he starts over, completely. I thanked her before ending the call. Looking across the fence, I saw workers removing steel reinforcement bars that had been installed only days earlier. Perfectly usable materials were stacked aside because they could no longer remain where they had been placed. It was impossible not to think about how much money had already been wasted. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't want Brian to lose everything. I had never wanted his project to fail. I had only wanted him to respect a property line that had existed long before either of us lived there. Late that afternoon, Brian glanced toward my yard. For a moment, I thought he might walk over. Instead, he lowered his eyes and turned back toward the demolition crew. The sound of breaking concrete continued until sunset. Every strike of the machinery carried the same quiet reminder. Ignoring the truth doesn't make it disappear. It only makes the cost of correcting it far more expensive. 3 days after the demolition crews arrived, the noise finally stopped. The broken concrete had been hauled away. The excavation had been partially filled, and temporary fencing surrounded what was left of the construction site. For the first time in nearly a month, I could sit on my back patio and hear nothing louder than birds and the breeze moving through the maple tree. I was trimming the hedges along the fence when I heard someone clear his throat. I looked up. Brian stood a few feet away on the other side of the property line. He wasn't wearing the tailored clothes I'd grown used to seeing. Instead, he had on faded jeans, an old sweatshirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. I set the hedge trimmer down. "Sure." For several seconds, he didn't speak. He simply looked at the ground between us. Finally, he sighed. "I handled this badly. I waited. When you first came over, I thought you were just trying to slow the project down. I wasn't. I know that now." He rubbed the back of his neck before continuing. "I should have looked at your survey instead of laughing at it." Neither of us spoke for a moment. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was simply honest. Brian glanced toward the empty construction site. "I've spent more money fixing this mistake than I would have spent checking the property lines in the first place." "I believe it." He gave a small, tired smile. "My attorney thinks we should try settling everything privately." My attorney suggested the same conversation. Brian nodded. "I'd like to reimburse you for the damaged landscaping and replace every rose bush my crew destroyed. I appreciate that. And if there's anything else..." He stopped before finishing the sentence. I answered carefully. "The attorneys can work through the details." "I figured you'd say that. It protects both of us." He slowly nodded again. "I guess I finally understand why you documented everything instead of arguing." I looked toward the wooden survey stake, still standing exactly where David Lawson had placed it. "Arguments depend on opinions," I said. "Evidence doesn't." Brian followed my eyes to the stake. "I laughed at that thing." "You did, and it ended up costing me more than anything else on this project." "No," I said quietly. "The stake didn't cost you anything." He looked back at me. The decision to ignore what it represented did. For the first time since we'd become neighbors, Brian didn't have an answer. He simply nodded once, wished me a good afternoon, and walked back toward his house with far slower steps than the confident man who had first arrived months earlier. The following weekend felt strangely peaceful. For the first time since Brian's renovation began, there were no engines rumbling through the neighborhood, no contractors shouting instructions, and no steady stream of delivery trucks blocking the street. People finally had time to talk. As I watered the new rose bushes I'd planted to replace the ones that had been destroyed, Mrs. Reynolds walked over carrying a small basket of homemade muffins. "I've been meaning to stop by," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." She smiled before looking toward Brian's backyard. "I owe you an apology." I frowned. "For what?" "I honestly thought you were making a bigger issue out of this than it really was." I laughed softly. "A lot of people did." She nodded. "I guess when someone speaks as confidently as Brian always did, you assume they're right. Confidence can be convincing, but facts matter more. They usually do." Over the next few days, several other neighbors stopped to chat. Some admitted they had believed Brian because his contractors seemed professional and his permits were displayed at the entrance. Others confessed they assumed I was simply resisting change. No one had realized that permits only mattered when the construction actually followed the approved property boundaries. One evening, Mr. Hernandez from across the street asked if he could see the survey. I brought out David Lawson's certified map. He studied it carefully before shaking his head. It really was 9 feet. It was, and all those measurements were verified? Twice. He folded the copy carefully before handing it back. "I've owned property for 30 years, he said. This reminds me that assumptions can become expensive. Word spread quietly throughout the neighborhood, not through gossip, through facts. People spoke about the official county notices, the certified survey, and the demolition that everyone had witnessed with their own eyes. The story gradually stopped being about an unfinished swimming pool. Instead, it became a reminder that property ownership carries responsibilities as well as rights. Standing in my backyard one evening, I looked along the freshly marked boundary line. Nothing about it had changed. It had always been there. The only difference now was that everyone finally knew exactly where it was and why respecting it mattered. Nearly 3 months passed before I saw construction equipment return next door. This time, the difference was obvious before a single machine entered the backyard. Instead of excavators, the first vehicle to arrive belonged to a licensed surveying company. David Lawson wasn't part of the crew, but another survey team followed the same careful process he had. They located every boundary marker, confirmed each measurement with GPS equipment, and placed fresh stakes exactly along the certified property line. Only after the survey was completed did the contractors begin unloading materials. Brian no longer stood in the yard, giving loud speeches or making confident predictions. Most days, he simply watched quietly while the crew worked from detailed drawings spread across a folding table. The redesigned pool was noticeably smaller. It sat comfortably inside his own backyard, leaving several feet of open space between the excavation and our shared property line. One afternoon, Brian walked over while I was mowing the lawn. They wouldn't even let us break ground until every measurement was verified, he said with a faint smile. I figured they wouldn't. They checked everything twice. I'd expect that after everything that happened. He nodded. So would I. A week later, I hired a fencing contractor. Not because I expected another dispute, because I wanted the property line to remain unmistakably clear long after both of us were gone. The crew installed a 6-foot decorative black aluminum fence directly along the certified boundary. It blended well with the neighborhood, allowing an open view while permanently marking where one property ended and the other began. When the final panel was secured, I walked its entire length. The fence didn't divide neighbors. It simply removed uncertainty. Brian came outside that evening and rested his hands on the top rail. It actually looks good, he admitted. I wanted something that fit the neighborhood. You could have built a solid privacy wall after everything. I could have, but I didn't want to. He looked across both backyards. I spent weeks trying to build something bigger than everyone else's. And now, he smiled quietly. Now I just want something that's mine. Over the following month, the smaller pool was completed without a single complaint from anyone on the street. No inspectors returned. No lawyers became involved. No new survey stakes appeared. Every contractor followed the approved plans exactly as they had been submitted. Sometimes, I'd sit beneath my grandfather's maple tree and watch the sunlight reflect off the water next door. It no longer reminded me of a dispute. Instead, it reminded me that respect begins with knowing where your own boundaries end and honoring someone else's just as carefully. Autumn arrived earlier than expected that year. The maple tree in my backyard had begun turning shades of red and gold, and cool evening air replaced the heavy heat that had filled the neighborhood throughout the summer. Life slowly returned to normal. One Saturday afternoon, I was raking leaves when I heard the familiar sound of Brian's gate opening. He walked toward the fence, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He stopped a few feet away. I wasn't sure if he'd want one. I smiled politely. I appreciate the offer. He carefully set 1 cup on the fence rail before taking a sip from the other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt very different from the first weeks after he'd moved in. There wasn't any tension anymore, only reflection. Brian looked toward his completed pool. You know, he said, I've replayed everything in my head more times than I can count. I leaned against the fence, and my biggest mistake wasn't hiring the wrong contractor. It wasn't. He slowly shook his head. No, he looked directly at me. My biggest mistake was believing confidence could replace verification. I nodded. I trusted people because they told me what I wanted to hear, and I assumed you wouldn't check. I noticed. He gave a quiet laugh at his own expense. When you first showed me your survey, I thought admitting I might be wrong would make me look weak. Instead, refusing to admit it cost me months of stress, a fortune in repairs, and a lot of respect. The honesty in his voice surprised me. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't an attempt to rewrite the past. It was simply the truth. I can't undo what happened, he continued. I know, but I am sorry. I considered his words carefully before answering. I accept your apology. He seemed relieved. Thank you. Accepting it doesn't erase what happened. I wouldn't expect it to. We stood quietly for another minute, watching leaves drift across the grass. Finally, Brian smiled. I think we're better neighbors now than we would have been if none of this had happened. Maybe. I've learned something at least. So have I. He picked up his empty coffee cup. I'll let you get back to your yard. As he walked toward his house, I realized something unexpected. Forgiveness didn't require forgetting. It didn't require becoming close friends. Sometimes it simply meant allowing a difficult chapter to stay in the past instead of carrying it into every tomorrow. Watching Brian disappear through his gate, I hoped both of us had finally learned where real respect begins. Almost a year has passed since the day Brian's construction came to an unexpected stop. If you drove through our neighborhood today, you would never guess how close a simple property dispute came to turning into a permanent legal battle. His backyard now has a beautiful swimming pool. Mine has a healthy row of rose bushes growing exactly where my grandfather planted the originals decades ago. Between them stands the black aluminum fence. Simple, straight, unmistakable. Every now and then, I catch myself looking toward the corner where David Lawson drove that single wooden survey stake into the ground. The stake itself is long gone. The county removed it after everything was resolved. But in my mind, I can still hear the sound of the hammer striking the wood. Tap, tap, tap. At the time, it looked almost insignificant. One small piece of wood standing beside a massive construction project. Brian laughed at it. Some of the workers laughed too. Even a few neighbors quietly assumed it wouldn't change anything. Yet that little marker represented something far stronger than any excavator, contractor, or expensive permit. It represented verified truth. Looking back now, I realize I could have handled everything very differently. I could have screamed across the fence. I could have argued with every worker. I could have let my frustration turn into anger. Instead, I chose photographs over accusations, certified surveys over assumptions, documentation over emotion. That decision changed everything. Not because it guaranteed I would win, because it guaranteed the facts would speak for themselves. Brian eventually rebuilt his project the right way. I restored my backyard. Our attorneys closed the final paperwork without another courtroom hearing. Life moved forward. Occasionally, new neighbors ask why our fence follows such a perfectly straight line. I usually smile and tell them it marks a lesson that was much more expensive than either homeowner expected. They often laugh, thinking I'm joking. I simply smile back, because some lessons don't need long explanations. They only need to be remembered. When I inherited this house, I thought my grandparents had left me a place to live. I understand now they left me something much greater. They left me a responsibility to protect what they spent a lifetime building, not through arguments, not through pride, but through patience, honesty, and respect for the truth. Sometimes people assume the loudest voice wins. Sometimes they believe wealth, confidence, or impressive paperwork automatically make someone right. But property lines don't move because someone speaks louder. Facts don't change because someone laughs at them. The truth waits quietly until someone is willing to prove it. Every time I sit beneath my grandfather's maple tree and watch the evening sun settle across both backyards, I'm reminded that the biggest victory wasn't stopping a swimming pool. It was refusing to surrender what was right simply because someone else believed I would. And in the end, it wasn't anger that protected my home. It was one careful survey, one quiet decision, and the patience to let the truth finish what I never had to fight for.